For the last few decades, humans have made unprecedented scientific advances, and we have produced some of mankind's most impressive achievements. We have split the atom and sequenced the genome. We have conquered space and nature itself. But did we destroy ourselves in the process?
Sometime between 1982 and 2000, we did something to the environment to totally decimate the protection system of our immune systems. Examples of this was certainly autism that you mentioned earlier. We had 1 in 5,000 children with autism in 1975. Today we have, just 3 weeks ago, released the most recent data, 1 in 36 children with an autism spectrum disorder. And so we have diseases in the brain and peripheral cancers, all of which took off at the same time in the mid-1990s. Autoimmune disease, unbelievable epidemic starting in the late 1990s.
Sperm count declined 50% in 50 years. A 50% decline means cutting it in half. Cut your sperm count in half? I don't think anyone wants to do that, right? It's the same thing with testosterone. It's also been going down at that same rate. Miscarriage or pregnancy loss has gone up in women at that same rate, and so on and so forth.
And so this was like the cracks that were starting to form in my worldview, that maybe there weren't 1,000 different diseases because they all started going epidemic at once, which really begged the question, is there a root cause of the root cause of the root cause of all disease? And I had really spent, 20 years of my life studying medicine, which was the opposite, where every year and minute you study in that environment, they try to convince you it's more and more complicated, that there's 1,000 different diseases, that there's 10,000 different drugs to treat those diseases.
You may ask yourself, what could do this? If all these diseases started happening at the same time, it seems plausible that there is a specific cause. This is where we learn our advances in science may not be that great after all. Because in the last 50 years we have added obscure amounts of man-made chemicals into our environment. Only now are we starting to realize the consequences that these substances have on our bodies and life as a whole. Take the so-called PFAS chemicals, for example. In 2015, the CDC found these highly toxic chemicals in the blood of many Americans. The researchers who found the chemicals wanted to conduct a study in order to find out what impact the chemicals had on humans. In this study, they needed a control group with clean blood. However, what the researchers found was truly horrifying.
There was no clean blood. They tested kids, they tested adults, they went to Asia, they went all over the world, and everywhere they looked practically, they found their chemicals in people's blood. Eventually, they did find some clean blood. It turned out it was the blood that had been taken from Army recruits and archived, saved, at the start of the Korean War.
So since these PFAS chemicals are seemingly inside every single one of us, let's take a look at what they actually are and what they do to our bodies.
PFAS are toxic chemicals linked to serious diseases like, cancer, liver damage, and thyroid disease. And guess what? They never, ever, ever degrade. In fact, they're known as forever chemicals.
They're so prevalent, CDC scientists believe PFAS chemicals are in the bloodstreams of nearly all Americans.
So once they're made, they just accumulate in the environment, they end up in our water supply, they end up in our food, and they end up in us.
You can't see it and you can't taste it. The kinds of impacts that occur with it take some time to develop.
This compound's a member of a class of compounds that are all thought to be able to make people sick, with cancers of various kinds, other kinds of dysfunction. We don't know the full extent of it.
So with what these scientists do know, we asked them if they think the water is safe enough to drink.
Nope, I drink tequila straight, but I won't drink tap water.
It doesn't go away. This is a man-made chemical. We just pass the baton to our generations of kids. In fact, if you were to incinerate and cremate me, I would technically be a fluorochemical hazardous source. The Teflon mesh that's used in my hernia produces a very toxic gas and decomposes to something called devil's piss, which is hydrofluoric acid. You can't kill this beast. You can only control it.
One of the first PFAS was discovered by accident in 1938 by researchers working for chemical giant DuPont. What made it special was its corrosion resistance, which is why it was used for valves in the first nuclear bomb.
The forever chemicals are in all of us. They are in our food and in our water. They only increase in quantity and cause worse and worse complications each year. The sad story is that these are far from the only chemicals we find in our bodies. Actually, we don't even know how many toxic chemicals we have put out there into the world.
They're put into products without safety testing, and then we see if they cause harm. And it can take 10, 20, 30 years to demonstrate that harm, and all that time people are being exposed.
In America, it falls to us, the ordinary people, to prove that these chemicals are toxic before the chemical is regulated by our government. That is simply backwards.
Right now, companies can sell products without declaring all the chemicals they contain, even if they're harmful for consumers.
So we're left with tens of thousands of chemicals on the market that we have no idea whether they are safe for consumption or not.
One of the most abundant chemicals out there today is the pesticide glyphosate. Glyphosate is also known as Roundup and has been called the most toxic product ever invented by man.
The current statistics is that less than 0.1% of the Roundup used on the planet actually hits a weed. The other 99.99% gets into the soil and into the water system and washes off. And then in the same moment, you've got the Mississippi River, which collects over 80% of all of the Roundup in the country, and then it's evaporating the whole time, so it's going into the air that you breathe, and then it goes into the clouds, and then it rains down on us. Recent studies in the air and rainfall in the southern United States is showing 75% of the rain, 75% of the air contaminated with Roundup. So before you even take a bite of food, you're being hit with an antibiotic when you breathe. You're getting hit with an antibiotic when you experience rainfall. And so you may be growing organic crops, but they're getting rained on. And so we have now locked this water-soluble toxin into our environment.
Glyphosate is an antibiotic by nature and will disrupt your gut microbiome as well as all other beneficial bacteria it comes in contact with. This alone is worrying, but it gets even worse than that.
Side effects of glyphosate that are outside of the 𝗕𝗵𝐴 pathway is direct injury to the protein structure that holds your gut lining together. This would be bad news if that was it, but it turns out that every macromembrane in your body, the blood vessels that fuel your entire body with oxygen and nutrients, are held together with the same tight junctions. The blood-brain barrier that protects your peripheral nervous system and your brain, same tight junctions. And so if that's true, if glyphosate was really damaging that, then we should see a massive explosion in neurologic injury to children and adults starting in about 1996. And that's exactly when we see this steep increase happening in autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, neurodegenerative conditions like MS, autoimmune diseases, and all the rest.
Glyphosate is only the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of thousands of chemicals out there today, if not millions. What about atrazine, for example? This is the chemical which Alex Jones famously blamed for turning frogs homosexual.
I'm like, shocked by it, so I'm up here bashing it because I don't like gay people. I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Serious crap.
Now this is of course pretty funny, but the disturbing part is that Alex Jones was actually somewhat right in his claim. At least in the sense that atrazine seems to be turning men into women.
We found that atrazine had demasculinizing effects on exposed males. So the voice box or the larynx didn't grow properly, testosterone levels were really low. We eventually found out that sperm production was really low. We also found out that the exposed males could be feminized. They would grow ovaries or grow eggs.
I thought more about why this might happen. So for example, if this were your testis, you shouldn't make testosterone. But we hypothesized that this atrazine turned on an enzyme aromatase that caused the testosterone to be converted to estrogen. And if you're a male, that means that you're using up your testosterone so you don't make sperm, but it also means that you're making the female hormone when you shouldn't be. It's just a correlation, but we already know, studies have already been done by the Center for Disease Control and others, that if you get pregnant doing peak atrazine contamination, you're more likely to have babies with birth defects. Because we all start out as aquatic in the amniotic fluid. And these chemicals that I study in my tadpoles can cross the placenta. In fact, we now know that your children will be exposed to over 300 synthetic chemicals before they leave the womb. And most of them, we have no idea what the biological impact is.
This brings us to another class of chemicals, which are arguably the worst ones. These are the chemicals that damage our hormones, such as the ones we get from plastic water bottles, cosmetics, and thousands of other things.
Our ordinary everyday lives are full of chemicals which escape from surrounding objects. Some have a special characteristic. They are capable of hijacking our hormonal intimacy, blocking our hormones or imitating them and affecting their levels. They are called endocrine disruptors.
An endocrine disrupting chemical is a chemical that in some way interferes with the body's endocrine system. So that's the system that produces, regulates, and deals with the body's many hormones.
This brings me to something I wanted to talk about for a while now. Some time back I was looking at the human endocrine system. When looking at a picture of this hormone system, I couldn't help but notice how similar the placements were to the chakras of the body. If you don't know what chakras are, they are essentially energy centers in our body which have been used as symbols by religions and spiritual people for thousands of years. According to these myths, a balanced chakra system leads to a form of homeostasis in the body, which opens the mind up to higher levels of consciousness. This all sounds a little up in the air, but it gets a lot less abstract once we realize that this was just a much more intuitive way of explaining the mysterious energies being produced by our endocrine system, the energies that we now call hormones. They are two ways of explaining the same thing, a spiritual way and a scientific way.
All energy is managed through the chakras. We have 7 of them. They're positioned throughout our bodies. It goes from the base of our spine all the way to the top of our head.
Natural hormones are produced by the endocrine system. The hypothalamus, the pineal, and the pituitary glands in the brain, the thyroid, the thymus, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the ovaries in women, and the testes in men.
The chakras are energy centers within our bodies. Since we're all energy, the ability of your energy centers to function optimally helps us physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. It's about bringing ourselves into balance.
The endocrine system manages to keep our bodies in a state of balance. And through its constant regulation, it drives the changes that ultimately help us become who we are.
Each chakra has its own vibrational frequency, has its own color, and governs specific functions that make up who we are.
Today we tend to think that we as humans know more about ourselves than ever before. Yet I can't help but think that ancient people had a much more intuitive and deep understanding of their existence. These people were not restricted by scientific materialism, and as a result, they were able to perceive things with a much more holistic and clear mindset.
These ancient wisdoms, for me, are beginning to make more and more sense because they're simplistic. We've tried to make things so complex. If you go to a Chinese doctor who's been passed down information for thousands of years, they will treat you with something from the earth. There's never anything artificial with that. Doesn't that make sense? That if we're connected to the earth, that everything we need to heal comes from it?
Traditional people seem to be very in touch with their own bodies and environment. This was clearly resembled by their excellent health and facial features. Today we have largely lost this connection to ourselves. No place is our modern and scientific worldview more evident than in the way we view our very own bodies. All throughout the history of our art and culture, we humans seem to have been fascinated by the sight of our own bodies. Even just the human face can captivate us. Our body truly is a miracle which scientists have yet to figure out. Scientific societies spend billions of dollars in the research of just one single human organ. And yet this research only leaves us with more questions than answers. Every single muscle fiber and nerve inside of your body performs a function. A function that goes much deeper than we could ever realize. Just one living cell inside of the human body is more complex than the entirety of New York City. We could never comprehend the full extent of our inner environment, but perhaps we never needed to. Before materialistic science dominated our world, people had a much more sacred view of the human anatomy. An example of this is our great tendency to put the human body at the center of historical art. Of course, the human body also plays a crucial role in many religions. Like Christianity, teaching us that we are made in the image of God and that our bodies are God's temple.
Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's.
If we go back to the chakra system, we will see that part of balancing the 7 different centers means activating the brow chakra, also known as the third eye. In modern terms, this would be our pineal gland, which is a little pine cone shaped gland placed in the center of the brain. With the knowledge we have today, we can see that these ancient people were actually onto something when they called the pineal gland our third eye. Because just as with a regular eye, the pineal is made up of a cornea, a lens, and a retina. The function of the pineal gland is not fully known, but we do know that it secretes many important hormones, such as melatonin. The pineal gland has always been represented as the mysterious link between the physical and spiritual worlds, which can be found in the human brain. In ancient Egypt, the Eye of Horus represented the Eye of God inside of the human mind. In Norse mythology, the leader of gods, Odin, is defined by only having one eye, after sacrificing the other to gain cosmic wisdom. Jesus also talked about making the eye single in the New Testament.
The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light.
Even the origins of Christianity seem to hint at the spiritual nature of the pineal gland.
And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved.
The pineal gland was often symbolized as a pine cone, like the staff of Osiris, which also have serpents searching upwards. These serpents seem to represent Kundalini energy, which rises up the spine, through the chakras, and into the pineal gland. This energy is also known as serpent energy, and is well known in many Eastern religions. But it also seems to find its way into the heart of the Bible, like when God spoke to Moses.
And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole.
And once again we see Jesus mention it in the New Testament.
And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life.
Now, I'm not saying any of these examples prove anything in particular. All I did was notice a pattern. People may very well have their doubts when it comes to the validity of these very old texts, but we have to realize that these are real texts written by real people. For some reason, these people all seem to place the same amount of importance on the same body parts and symbols. What they seem to point at is some sort of transcendental state which happens when the body has energy or spirit flowing uninterrupted through it. For Christianity, this was the Holy Spirit, and for yogis, it was Kundalini energy. Today we have largely discredited all of this. Most people deem it as superstitious nonsense, which doesn't have the practical use that we so desperately crave as modern humans. We choose instead to focus on a much more materialistic understanding of our physiology and life as a whole. Religions lost their appeal, and so did our collective faith in higher powers. The God-shaped hole in our society was filled by materialistic science, which described our world as if there was no place in it for gods, spirits, or chakras. No place in it for higher values or ideals. No place in it for anything but the regular clockwork movement which turns the moon around the earth and the earth around the sun for no purpose whatsoever. Science gave us the so-called enlightenment vision, but this way of viewing the world only seemed to be making us worse and worse versions of ourselves. There was no longer anything divine or sacred about the human body. It was no longer the temple of God or the home of energy and spirits. It was a clunky, malfunctioning machine which needed constant support and spare parts from humans. We toxified our mind and body with pollutants and stress, while we physically started to resemble or merging with the machines. We got caught up in a view of the world where everything happened randomly and where nothing had any intrinsic meaning. Everything we see through our eyes is all there is, and only that which can be seen and measured is real. It is this worldview which opens us up to the physical and mental health crisis we see in our modern world. It is this worldview which makes us forget who we truly are.
So far I've been describing to you that we are losing the identity between the outside world and our immune system by the breakdown of these membranes. We get leak. That's literally taking away self-identity from the immune system, and so we get autoimmune disease where we're starting to react to our own body as if it was foreign. In the same way, at the macro level, I believe we're losing our self-identity as human beings as we start to leak. And we start to become majorly depressed, panic disorder. We start to get lost down these rabbit holes of doubt, insecurity, fear, guilt. We have spiritual crisis. We have relationship crisis that's on an epidemic level equal to cancer and beyond. It's because we are literally losing self-identity at the cell level because we are eating a chemical that breaks our self-identity at the cell level. I think that's what's happening to our society right now. We have a sickness and a disease on the planet of loss of self-identity and human consciousness of our purpose here, only to trigger the ultimate healing process, which is to realize that we're all one. We are all on one mission to find truth in ourselves and through one another. We are calling in community. We are going to overcome the isolation of our cell phone era. We're going to start to touch each other more. We're going to hug each other more because we have to.
This is the good news. There is a solution. A solution which has been here all the time. Everything we need is right here. It only requires us to reach a different level of understanding. A level of understanding which wakes us up from the deep spiritual slumber we find ourselves in the 21st century. You are not your flesh or your thoughts. There is something behind that. Something which has always been there, and which is deeply wise.
Looking at the world through a keyhole, and you've spent your whole life trying to widen that keyhole, to see more, to know more, and now, on hearing that it can be widened in ways you can't imagine, you reject the possibility.
No, I reject it because I do not believe in fairy tales about chakras or energy or the power of belief. There is no such thing as spirit. We are made of matter and nothing more. You're just another tiny, momentary speck within an indifferent universe.
Now here is true wisdom, because it is only those who believe that the world has a soul who may have one of their own. Those who believe the world is a machine will themselves become machines. Choose wisely.
I'm sorry the world hurt you. I will cry the tears you haven't shed. I will wail the grief you've kept inside. We're going to make it better. Remember the teaching of Father. Behold, I make all things new. Things are changing now. You are entering the unknown. So have faith, my child. You don't need fear anymore. Rest now, my sweet. I'm always with you. You're doing great. The world needs you to rise, to remember. Let go of the stories, the lies of your culture, the programs of your parents. See the truth. I love you as I love anything that has ever existed. I love you as my son.